welcome to Seed Speaks. This is a video series brought to you by Seed World Group. My name is Mark Zinkowitz, and I am an editor with Seed World Group. And this month we are talking about the politics of seed. This is actually the last episode in our season on the politics of seed. And I'm joined today by two people who can definitely speak to the issue of politics as it affects gene editing regulations. Petra Jorasch is manager of plant breeding innovation advocacy for Euroseeds based in Belgium. She couldn't be on live today, but I recorded an interview with her the other day. I'm going to play some excerpts of that interview. Petra holds a PhD in plant molecular biology from the University of Hamburg in Germany and is an internationally recognized science communication and industry advocacy expert with more than 2 decades of experience in the relevant policy frameworks for seeds, plant science, and breeding, access and use of plant genetic resources, as well as relevant intellectual property protection systems. I'm joined live today by Mendel Perkins, our second guest. Mendel is lead scientist at AgGene in Alberta, Canada. Mendel graduated from the University of British Columbia in 2022 with a PhD. He has authored publications in wetland ecology, canola biotechnology, and the biochemistry and cell biology of plant cell walls. Mendel has learned a range of skills from these diverse experiences that support AgGene's projects, including molecular biology, tissue culture, gene editing, and biochemistry. Mendel spends most of his time in AgGene's lab performing the molecular work necessary to edit the genomes of plants. Welcome, Mendel. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing well. Yeah, I'm very. It's always good to have an opportunity to talk about gene editing and this kind of thing. That's what we think about kind of all the time at AgGene. So glad to be here.
Hey, well, thank you for your time. Now, today, like I said, I want to talk about gene editing as it pertains to the European Union and Canada. Now, before we hear from Petra, Mendel, you recently had some good news come your way here in Canada. Earlier this year, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency issued some long awaited guidance and clarified that it will essentially not regulate gene editing the same way it regulates GMOs. Now, researchers like yourself were very pleased to finally have this guidance from our federal government. Can you tell us in a nutshell why this was such good news for someone like you and the company that you work with?
Yeah, this, like you say, this news was, of course, very welcome for us at AgGene. We're working on a portfolio of traits. We are working in the more traditional GMO space and also working to develop traits via gene editing. And so that the clarity from both Health Canada and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency really give us the confidence to move forward. And also the investment community has the confidence then in businesses like us to move forward. We did, like you say, unfortunately have to wait a little longer than maybe we'd hoped for those regulations, but really quite pleased with the direction they've gone. Those regulations in Canada broadly are focused on the downstream outputs of the process. That is the characteristics of the food products or animal feeds and any possible risks in sort of a process agnostic manner, that the technologies used to make those are less important than the actual output and implications of the end products. Of course, there's also considerations for any environmental risks as well in the process, but the focus is really on those resulting crops and ultimate food products. From our perspective, this is a sensible way to regulate things for a few reasons. It does, and when you read some of the language that has come out of those decisions, is they're looking back at decades of safe and effective use of biotechnology and recombinant DNA technologies as have been implemented in the Canadian market. And by making it a process agnostic system, it really leaves the door open to ongoing innovation, which there's plenty of. There's likely to be new gene editing tools. There's new variations published all the time. So we can, I think, under Canada's regulatory framework, adopt those relatively easily within existing regulations, and that'll really foster continuing innovation.
Yeah, well, and you waited for this guidance from CFIA for quite a long time, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it was definitely good news for you here in Canada for sure. Now, over in the EU, as I'm sure you know, Mendel, the situation is quite a bit different. I wish I could say that plant breeders in the EU are now free to use gene editing in their work without having to jump through the same regulatory hoops that GMOs jump through, but that's not the case, unfortunately. And I'm going to let Petra explain the situation over in the EU for us over the next few minutes. I'm just going to play an excerpt from my interview with her the other day. She's going to tell us all about what researchers in the European Union are faced with when it comes to gene editing regulations. Here's Petra. I was hoping you could start off by describing the regulatory situation in the EU. Can you give us a little overview of the current regulatory landscape for gene editing in the EU? What are the key regulations right now and the guidelines that are in place?
Sure. Maybe I start a bit with like a historical overview. This discussion on how genome editing and other new breeding technologies should be regulated has been ongoing for quite a while in the EU. So it actually started already in 2008 when the Commission established a member states expert working group to look at new breeding technologies. At that time, CRISPR-Cas was not even discovered or developed as a breeding tool. And then, of course, the discussion on how should those products coming out of those technologies be regulated. And the question was, are they GMOs as to our GMO directive, which is from 2001? Or are they conventional breeding? And so this group came out with an advice which has never been officially published, and then discussions were ongoing until actually in 2016 a European Court of Justice case came up. It was raised by some French farming groups, and so then the question was really in front of the court. So how should mutagenesis as such, but also new mutagenesis methods like genome editing be regulated? And in 2018, we had a European Court of Justice ruling on that file, and this actually clarified that those technologies and the resulting products are genetic technologies for genetic modification, and with this, the resulting products are also GMOs. And this is because the European definition of what constitutes a GMO has been interpreted by the court in a process-based manner. So meaning it's not the outcome, the product, which is decisive for the question, is it a GMO or not, but the process with which you develop such a product. And since those processes are rather new, and we also have this history of safe use element in our regulation, yeah, they consider those processes and resulting products to be GMOs under our current GMO regime.
So, in other words, in the EU, products that are derived from gene editing are treated just like GMOs. And so in the EU, they actually do things the opposite of the way we do them here in Canada. As you know, Mendel, here in Canada, it's the end product that matters. And if the end product is the same as what could have been achieved through so-called conventional plant breeding, then it's not considered a GMO, does not fall under the same regulations. The EU, they're doing the opposite of that. It's the process that matters. It's not the end product. It's how you've made that product. And so they're really looking at it a lot differently than what we do here in Canada. And unfortunately, researchers like you, Mendel, in the EU aren't free to use this technology without facing the same regulatory restrictions that GMOs face. Now, like I said earlier, Mendel, you waited for quite a few years for the CFIA to issue its recent guidance on this. So people like you were in limbo for a long time here in Canada, waiting for that guidance. You know, you had plans, you had research you wanted to do, but you know, you didn't maybe want to do it, or you only went so far because you weren't sure what CFIA was going to ultimately do. You didn't want to do a lot of research, invest a lot of money in something, then find out, oh, we're going to be under the same restrictions that GMOs are under. In your experience, Mendel, how is innovation hampered by restrictive regulation? When you think back to all that time you waited for CFIA to release its guidance, how did that affect you in terms of innovation?
Yeah, no, for sure. We were of course eagerly awaiting those guidance and decisions from CFIA and Health Canada on this matter. And myself and a lot of other researchers had been in the position of using these tools in an academic research capacity for years by the time we had actually gotten regulations about how we would be able to use them, in a commercial and in the field real world capacity. And we were forced to watch as other international jurisdictions had made their policies clear over the past several years. Like there was much more clarity in Japan after 2019, Brazil as early as 2018, the USA even a couple of years ago in 2020. And we had less confidence in what routes we had much more confidence in our ability to do the science, and a lot of what we were worried about was whether we'd be able to use the science that we were quite confident we could do. And we ran the risk of running behind it in two capacities, both as actually being able to use those technologies and hopefully establishing ourselves, being the the strength that the Canadian marketplace has, that why shouldn't we, and shouldn't we be a leader in innovation in these kinds of technologies and developing new traits that way? So yeah, we definitely felt it, and it was big news and good news at AgGene when we finally got those answers. And I think that there historically has been and is likely going to continue to be a brain drain from those more restrictive jurisdictions to more accommodating jurisdictions. This is, of course, just anecdotes from my own experience, but I've had the opportunity to interact with academics and industry researchers from Europe, and you hear their frustrations about what they're allowed to do, or maybe they are able to do some promising work in maybe an academic setting, and there's no hope that it's ever going to go anywhere into the field. I recently spoke with an individual who had, he's had quite a long and storied career, and in a mid-career capacity, he left Europe, and part of the reason he said was because of the regulations on GMOs there, and he's now, in a quite a senior role at a multinational in North America, doing the work that he would not have been able to do in Europe. So it seems to me that, yeah, this brain drain and suppression of potentially good and useful ideas has occurred and may continue to occur.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, we just had an audience question. Actually, Ashley Robinson asked, will the EU decision on gene editing reduce the opportunities for EU researchers to work with their colleagues internationally? And so how does that work, Mendel? I'm curious, like in terms of, yeah, EU researchers being to work internationally, say with someone like you, like, do you have a harder time working with a researcher over in the EU? Like if they're not allowed to use this technology in a commercial way and without having to jump through all these other regulatory hoops, that must affect you. If you find yourself in a situation having to work with this person, I imagine it must complicate things to some extent.
Yeah, no, and that definitely factors into decisions that we make with what jurisdictions we're targeting for, say, field trials of our technology. We basically just would not at this point consider Europe. We would look at, around Canada and the United States, other jurisdictions. And, there's crops that we're working in, like field peas, that are grown in Europe, and we would love to have our technology there, but it's just not really an option at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Now, there is a bit of good news. I was in my talk with Petra. She mentioned there's actually a glimmer of hope. The door apparently has not been completely closed to changing things in the EU. there might still be a chance that the EU Commission might, in a way, reverse its decision that gene editing might actually not fall under GMO regulations in the future. I'm going to let Petra explain that, as it's a little bit complicated. So we best hear from Petra on that, so I don't get something wrong. So we will hear from her again now. Now, can you talk a little bit about that? I understand that it sort of represents a glimmer of hope, you might say, that gene-edited products in the European Union might end up not being regulated the same way as GMOs. I understand that the United Kingdom, because it's no longer a member of the European Union, has actually taken a different approach. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the United Kingdom has said that it will not regulate gene-edited products the same way as GMOs. And so it sounds like you have hope that the EU might follow suit.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. So maybe I start with the UK. So they, shortly after they exited the EU, they started having a discussion on how to regulate genome editing and certain genome edited products. And what they have now put in place is a so-called precision breeding bill. With this bill, they kind of follow approaches that have also been taken by many other countries around the world, South American countries, but also Australia, the US, Canada. So really taking a differentiated approach and regulating along the lines if the product resulting from those technologies can also be achieved by conventional breeding methods. They are not regulated as GMOs. If they are different from what you can achieve by conventional breeding, they are still regulated as GMOs. And that's how the UK started also drafting their regulation, which is now already adopted. They are still waiting for some secondary legislation, but from what I understand, they might have a fully operational system in place sometime end of next year. And the EU proposal, in fact, also kind of follows a similar line of thinking. So the Commission proposes to establish a verification process, which verifies if a product indeed is what they call conventional like. And then this product would also be not regulated as a GMO, or if it's GMO-like, and then they propose a system which is still GMO. So these products would fall under the GMO regime, but with a more targeted risk assessment approach. So two categories: GMO-like, conventional-like. Each of them with some specific requirements, but in principle, it's the line which many countries also take. Yes.
So what timeline are you looking at for this new EU proposal? If it goes through, if the EU says, okay, we will soften the stance on this, we will not regulate gene-edited products the same as GMOs, when might that door potentially be opened?
Yeah, I mean, we have three, let's say, institutions in the EU. So the Commission can propose a legislation. So that's what they did beginning of July. So they put forward this draft proposal. And now it's up to the Council, which is the group of member states, and the Parliament, the EU Parliament, to discuss the proposal and to come forward also with potential amendments. And then in the end, these three institutions need to agree on a joint text to adopt it and to make it operational also. So we currently have in the council, we have the Spanish council presidency. They are very committed to proceed with the discussion, and they want to conclude the discussions by the end of this year. Let's see if that's realistic, but they have scheduled regular meetings with council experts so that they hopefully can advance. With the parliament, it's currently still, the discussion is still who actually will be the rapporteur and the shadow rapporteurs from the different parties to proceed with the file, to start the discussion. And the challenging thing is that we have EU elections next year in June, which means the European Parliament will be newly elected. And if the discussion has not been finalized up until then, the new parliament needs to take it up again, which will likely be only beginning of 2025. So the elections can kind of interrupt the discussions and the proceedings. And yeah, we need to see if it's possible to agree, at least in the responsible committee, on a joint text. And then it, of course, needs to be also decided in the plenary. But yeah, let's see. So there is, it's challenging, but we also see certain political commitments by those who will be responsible. So I think they do what they can. We need to see how far they can get.
So politics, as usual, doesn't matter where you go in the world, there's politics that affects our industry. But in other words, the EU plant breeding community could reap huge benefits if this legislation goes through. So it's good news, Mendel, obviously, that there's some hope in that regard. Now, as you mentioned earlier, Canadian researchers like yourself have somewhat of a head start on this, as you're now free to use this technology without regulatory uncertainty. Mendel, I'm going to ask you to gaze into your crystal ball for a moment. What innovation do you see possibly coming down the pipe in Canada because of technology like gene editing?
Yeah, for sure. Gene editing opens up a lot of possibilities. For starters, here at AgGene, it's facilitating us to work across a broad range of species and generate mutants of key genes related to protein accumulation. It like we've talked about in many of the regulations, there's things that we're aiming to do with gene editing that could hypothetically have been done with conventional breeding, but it's something that we're able to do in a much more targeted and much faster manner. Working across peas, soybeans, chickpeas, rice, and canola simultaneously. If we were trying to do mutant populations of all of those species, that would just be a much more onerous task than trying to go after those targeted mutation. It's likely cutting years off of our development timelines for the traits we're working on. I also see gene editing being used very much in concert with conventional breeding programs. From my own PhD research, I had used CRISPR-Cas9 to make a gene edit in an instance where, because of genetic linkage, I had access to both of the alleles that I wanted, but they were too closely genetically linked to get there. So it can be this tool that you come in strategic ways into conventional breeding programs, and then really gene editing is it's a tool that you can point at sort of anything. It's really the only limit is the underlying discovery research that you're discovering those gene targets and those physiological and regulatory pathways within the plants that you might want to manipulate. So there's lots of promising avenues towards disease resistance, heat and drought tolerance, altering the taste of various crops, maybe amino acid composition. So yeah, the world is kind of your oyster, and as long as you've got a good idea of what's going on, then you can start tinkering in those pathways in the plant.
Yeah, I asked Petra a similar question in regards to what's coming down the pipe for the EU if this new legislation passes. So we're just going to hear from Petra once more. It's going to kind of give us that bigger picture of what could happen, what benefits there could be for the EU if this happens on a global level. So we'll hear from Petra once more before we sign off for the day. Assuming that this goes through and that the EU says, okay, we will not regulate gene edited products the same as GMOs, we will take a softer stance on that. If that happens, hopefully it will, what global implications could that have? I realize it would have very positive impact for the EU plant breeding sector, but taking a global outlook, what benefits could that possibly have?
Well, I think, we are discussing climate impact on agricultural production, etc. So, and the role the EU needs to take also in view of food security. And I guess these are all like elements which would help European agriculture to be productive, and for the EU to play a role in, let's say, global agricultural production. And of course it would simply, or it would not create, let's say, additional trade hurdles between the EU and their trading partners, who already have a more, let's say, relaxed regulatory system for those type of products in place. So that could definitely help facilitate agricultural trade and food production in the end. And also for the EU, I mean, we have very ambitious goals in view of our Green Deal and our farm to fork strategy. Agriculture should become more sustainable, less pesticides, less fertilizers. And of course, these are tools which could help farmers to meet these goals. And yeah, that's at least the hope we have, but also the hope farmers have, because currently the discussion is more about always reduction targets, but not about providing tools to farmers. And I mean, there are other tools as well, like digital tools, like smart agriculture, etc. But this all comes with high investments for farmers, while better seeds are still seeds. So that's probably the most affordable innovations farmers can have access to.
Politics. Like I say, this is the last episode of our season on how politics affects the seed world. Imagine, Mendel, for a minute, a world where we followed the science instead of the politics. And that would be an interesting world indeed. But before I sign off, Mendel, I kind of want to end on that note. What's your piece of advice, Mendel, to policymakers in terms of how they can move forward in crafting good legislation? Because I mean, technologies like gene editing are only going to become more advanced, more sophisticated. We're going to be able to do more. We're going to be able to breed quicker. I mean, once this gets off the ground, just like any technology, things are going to move quickly. So if you had one piece of advice, Mendel, for policymakers on how they can follow the science and make good legislation, what would that piece of advice be?
Yeah, like you say, I think that's one of the things I think about a lot, is that CRISPR-Cas9 is great, and those first generation tools like that, but that's not going to be the last word. I'm quite sure of that. I definitely like the direction that Canada has gone with sort of a process agnostic regulation regime. I think helps in that regard, that there's going to be new versions, there's going to be new genes, there's going to be there's things that are coming down the pipe of what can be done in terms of editing sequences and inserting DNA sequences. The capabilities of the tools are really expanding. So if regulations that are in place now and being drafted now can allow for that, sort of open-ended uptake of new and varied versions of this, without having to go back to the drawing board every few years and amend them and go through another lengthy bureaucratic process, that would be a real advantage. And I think another thing to consider is just that there are some realities of gene editing that and I think a lot of countries have already adopted this sensibility that it's possible to make gene edits that are indistinguishable from mutations and variation that you would find from other sources. So if you may write a regulation that's very restrictive and says you cannot use this, but if, let's say, you're the individual working in a regulatory capacity at a port, importing a ship full of seeds, and you're tasked with the molecular biology question of, are there gene edits in this seed, you won't be able to answer that question definitively. So I think the regulations that make an equivalency between these are edits that could have been made in other ways, and that those should be regulated equivalently, I think has a certain just practical reality of, there are things that you can do that are undetectable. Not that I suggest anybody misrepresent what they're doing, and that's of course not anything we would do at AgGene, but I think it's a reality that an inspector looking at a shipment is going to be faced with.
Yeah, I think a big takeaway is that we need flexible, nimble regulation. And those of us who are watching this, who are familiar with seed regulatory modernization are going to say that's why we need incorporation by reference. But I won't get into that. That's a whole separate issue. We're not talking about SRM today. But thank you so much, Mendel, for your insights. It was great to have you on today. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me. And it's always fun to talk about gene editing.
Thank you again. And thank you to our audience for spending part of your lunch hour with us. Next week, we're going to be taking a bit of a break from our live broadcast. We're going to announce our new season of Seed Speaks, which starts next month. So stay tuned for that. Thank you again for tuning into Seed Speaks today. This is Mark Zinkowitz signing off. Have a great day, everybody. And thank you to Petra, who wasn't able to be on live today. Thank you so much, Petra. I appreciate your time. Take care, everybody.